I stand bleeding on the marble floor of an upscale wedding venue, my white dress shirt stained crimson from a gash above my left eyebrow. The ornate metal cake stand lies twisted beside me, wedding guests, frozen in horror. My sister Grace stands in her $1,000 gown, tears streaming down her face, while our parents tower above me with rage-filled expressions. The silence breaks when Grace's fiancé, Marcus, steps forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Before anyone calls the police, there's something about this family you all need to hear." 3 years ago, I bought my dream home. Not inherited, not gifted, but earned through every blister on my hands and every drop of sweat on my brow. My name is Easton, and at 25, I had saved $43,000 working double shifts at Patterson Construction Company. While other guys my age blew their paychecks at bars or fancy restaurants, I lived in a cramped studio apartment, ate ramen noodles for dinner, and put every spare dollar into my house fund. The colonial-style home in Westfield looked like a disaster when I first saw it. Peeling paint covered the exterior, the front porch sagged dangerously, and the previous owners had abandoned it after a messy divorce. The real estate agent Janet Morrison warned me about the extensive repairs needed. The foundation had minor cracks, the electrical system dated back to the 1970s, and the plumbing leaked in 3 different places. But I saw potential where others saw problems. The bones of the house were solid, the neighborhood was improving, and the price was right at $215,000. I put down my life savings and took out a mortgage for the rest. The first year nearly broke me. I spent every weekend learning skills I never thought I'd need. YouTube became my best friend as I watched countless videos on electrical wiring, pipe fitting, and tile installation. My hands bled from working with rough lumber, my back ached from crawling through the cramped basement, and my bank account drained faster than I could refill it. I started with the essentials. The electrical system required a complete overhaul, which meant tearing out walls and running new copper wire throughout the entire house. I learned to read circuit diagrams and installed new outlet switches and a modern breaker box. The inspector passed my work on the first try, which felt like winning the lottery. Next came the plumbing nightmare. The old galvanized pipes had corroded so badly that water barely trickled from the faucets. I spent 3 months replacing every inch of plumbing with PEX tubing, installing a new water heater, and updating all the fixtures. The master bathroom became my pride and joy, complete with a walk-in shower, double vanity, and heated floors that I installed myself. The kitchen renovation took another 6 months. I demolished the old cabinets, which were falling apart from water damage, and built new ones from scratch using oak wood I bought at a lumber yard clearance sale. The granite countertops cost me $2,000, but I negotiated with the supplier to get remnant pieces that fit perfectly after careful measuring. I installed a subway tile backsplash, new stainless steel appliances, and pendant lighting that transformed the space completely. Throughout this process, I rarely saw my family. My parents had divorced when I was 12, and my father, Robert, essentially vanished from our lives. He sent birthday cards occasionally, but never visited or called. My mother, Diana, lived across town with my younger sister, Grace, who was attending community college and working part-time at a boutique. The house became more than just a place to live. It represented everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed, and everything I had achieved on my own. Every nail I hammered, every board I cut, and every room I painted carried my sweat and determination. The original hardwood floors, which I spent weeks refinishing with a rented sander, gleamed like mirrors. The stone patio I built in the backyard provided a perfect spot for morning coffee and evening relaxation. By my 28th birthday, the house was worth $460,000, according to the latest appraisal. I had increased its value by more than double through my own labor and investment. Friends constantly complimented the transformation, and neighbors stopped by just to see the incredible renovation work I had accomplished. Then Grace showed up at my front door on a rainy Tuesday evening, sobbing uncontrollably. Her mascara had streaked down her cheeks, and her usually perfect hair hung limp and disheveled. She clutched a tissue box in one hand, and her purse in the other, shivering despite her thick winter coat. "Easton, I need your help," she whispered between gasps. "I'm pregnant, and Marcus says he won't marry me unless I have somewhere respectable to live. My apartment is too small, and I can't afford anything bigger on my salary. Could I maybe stay in your guest room for just a few months while we save up for our own place?" Looking at my sister's tear-stained face, I couldn't say no. The guest bedroom sat empty anyway, and family was supposed to help family during difficult times. I had no idea this decision would nearly cost me everything I had built. Grace and Marcus moved in the following weekend with what seemed like half a moving truck's worth of belongings. I had expected a few suitcases and personal items, but they arrived with furniture, kitchen appliances, and enough clothes to fill 2 closets. Marcus Thompson was a tall, lean man with perfectly styled brown hair and an expensive wardrobe that seemed odd for someone who claimed financial struggles. The first week went smoothly enough. Grace thanked me constantly for my generosity, and Marcus praised my renovation work while helping with grocery shopping. They kept their belongings in the guest room and bathroom, respecting my space and house rules. I began to think maybe this arrangement would work out fine. But subtle changes started in the second week. Grace began rearranging items in the common areas, moving my books to make room for her magazines, and relocating my coffee maker to accommodate her fancy espresso machine. When I mentioned it, she apologized sweetly and claimed she was just trying to make the space work better for everyone. Marcus started making comments about my lifestyle choices. During breakfast one morning, he wondered aloud why a single man needed such a large house when young families struggled to find decent housing. He suggested that my 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom home was excessive for one person and implied that I was being wasteful with resources that could benefit others. Grace picked up on these themes and expanded them. She questioned why I spent Friday nights reading in my home office instead of going out to meet potential partners. She criticized my furniture choices, saying the leather recliner looked too masculine and the oak dining table was too formal for a comfortable family atmosphere. She even suggested I convert my home gym into a nursery because exercise equipment was selfish when a baby needed space. Their mother, Diana, started visiting more frequently, something that had rarely happened before Grace moved in. During these visits, she would walk through the house, making observations about how certain rooms would be perfect for children and how the backyard needed playground equipment instead of my vegetable garden. She questioned why I maintained such high homeowners insurance when I lived alone and suggested I was wasting money on unnecessary coverage. The conversations became increasingly uncomfortable as they ganged up on me with coordinated arguments about family responsibility and social obligation. Diana would start by mentioning how Grace needed stability during her pregnancy, then Marcus would add comments about responsible resource sharing, and Grace would finish with emotional appeals about family unity and support. They began inviting people over without asking my permission first. Grace's friends from work came for dinner parties, where they discussed baby shower plans and nursery decorating ideas. Marcus brought his buddies to watch football games, and they treated my home theater system and leather sectional like their personal entertainment center. When I objected to the lack of consultation, Grace accused me of being controlling and antisocial. The guilt campaigns intensified as Grace's pregnancy progressed. She would rub her growing belly while sighing about how cramped the guest bedroom felt and how she worried about raising a child in such limited space. She mentioned constantly how her friends with babies all had nurseries and playrooms, while she would be stuck in a single bedroom with no space for baby furniture. Marcus began working late more often, leaving Grace and me alone for conversations that always turned to housing arrangements. She would cry about feeling like a burden and express fears that Marcus might change his mind about marriage if their living situation didn't improve. She painted pictures of their relationship falling apart if she couldn't provide a stable home environment for their future child. Diana escalated her involvement by bringing photo albums of Grace's childhood and talking about how Grace had always dreamed of having a beautiful home like the one I had built. She shared stories of Grace's disappointments with her cramped apartment and her embarrassment when friends visited her tiny kitchen and shared bathroom. She suggested that as the older brother, I had an obligation to help my younger sister achieve her dreams of domestic happiness. The pressure became relentless and coordinated with all three of them, taking shifts wearing down my resistance through emotional manipulation and guilt. They made me feel selfish for wanting to maintain ownership of the home I had built with my own hands and paid for with my own money. Then I overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. Grace was in the kitchen talking to Diana while she thought I was outside working in the yard, but I had come back inside to get my tools and heard Grace's voice clearly through the thin wall. "The pregnancy was perfectly timed, Mom," Grace said with a laugh completely different from her usual tears and emotional appeals. "Marcus never threatened to leave me. We planned this whole thing to create leverage for the house situation. He's actually excited about getting married and thinks Easton's house would be perfect for starting our family. We just need to keep up the pressure until he realizes that signing over the house is the right thing to do." My blood ran cold as I listened to my sister admit that everything had been a calculated manipulation. The tears, the fears, the desperate appeals for help had all been theater designed to steal my home. Grace's engagement announcement came 3 weeks later with all the fanfare of a Hollywood premiere. She and Marcus had supposedly gotten engaged during a romantic weekend getaway to Napa Valley, complete with a professional photographer who captured his proposal among the vineyard rows. The diamond ring was enormous, at least 2 carats, which seemed expensive for a couple claiming financial hardship. She immediately began planning an elaborate wedding that would cost more than most people's annual salaries. The guest list included 200 people. The venue was the historic Riverside Manor with its crystal chandeliers and marble floors, and the catering menu featured premium selections that started at $150 per person. For someone worried about affording basic housing, Grace seemed remarkably comfortable spending massive amounts on a single-day celebration. The wedding planning meetings took over my house completely. Grace insisted on hosting all vendor consultations in what she now called her home, bringing wedding planners, florists, caterers, and photographers through my living room without asking my permission. She gave them tours of the entire house, describing her vision for how different rooms would look during various wedding events. The florist Margaret Chen spread fabric samples and flower arrangements across my dining room table, while Grace explained how the house's color scheme would coordinate with her wedding palette. The wedding planner David Martinez measured my living room to determine how many guests could fit for a potential engagement party. The photographer Susan Walsh took test shots throughout the house to plan lighting for pre-wedding photos. During these meetings, Grace consistently referred to the house as hers. She told vendors about her beautiful kitchen where the bridal party would get ready, and her spacious backyard where they might hold the rehearsal dinner. She pointed out her hardwood floors that would be perfect for dancing, and her master bedroom where she and Marcus would live after the honeymoon. Marcus participated enthusiastically in these discussions, offering opinions about furniture arrangements and suggesting modifications to better accommodate their future needs. He recommended removing my home office to create a formal dining room for entertaining and converting my workout room into a nursery for their expanding family. He spoke about these changes as if they were already decided, not suggestions for someone else's property. Our father Robert suddenly reappeared after years of absence, drawn back by news of Grace's engagement and pregnancy. He showed up at my front door one evening with a bottle of expensive whiskey and a newfound interest in family relationships. His hair had gone completely gray, and he had gained considerable weight, but his manipulative charm remained unchanged. Robert praised my renovation work while simultaneously questioning my decision to live alone in such a large space. He suggested that successful men my age should be focused on building families rather than accumulating material possessions. He shared stories about his own regrets regarding family priorities and urged me to learn from his mistakes by putting Grace's needs ahead of my personal desires. During family dinners that Grace orchestrated, Robert would hold court at the head of my dining room table discussing Grace's wedding plans and future housing needs. He spoke about family traditions and obligations, emphasizing how older siblings had historically helped younger ones establish their households. He mentioned cousins and family friends who had made similar arrangements, painting my situation as completely normal and expected. Diana joined these dinner discussions with renewed energy, treating Robert's presence as an opportunity to present a united front regarding Grace's housing situation. She brought old family photos showing previous generations sharing homes and resources, arguing that family cooperation was part of our heritage. She talked about grandparents who had helped children buy their first homes and parents who had made sacrifices to ensure their children's success. The three of them developed a routine of coordinated pressure that felt like being slowly squeezed in a vice. Robert would start conversations about family legacy and responsibility. Diana would add emotional appeals about Grace's vulnerability during pregnancy, and Grace would finish with tears and expressions of gratitude for my eventual cooperation. They took turns wearing me down with different approaches designed to break my resistance. Grace began leaving real estate magazines around the house, with pages marked showing smaller homes that would be more appropriate for a single man. She pointed out condominiums and townhouses that would require less maintenance and cost less to heat and cool. She suggested that I was wasting money on property, taxes, and utilities for space I didn't really need or use. Marcus started bringing up the house's market value during casual conversations, mentioning how property values in the neighborhood had increased and how much equity I had built through my renovations. He suggested that I could afford to be generous with Grace because the house represented such a significant financial asset. He implied that sharing this wealth with family was both practical and morally correct. The wedding planning intensified as the date approached, with more vendors and more meetings filling my house with strangers discussing Grace's vision for her future. But I started paying closer attention to the details and noticed discrepancies that raised serious questions about their true intentions. During a conversation with the real estate photographer Grace had hired for wedding photos, I learned she had actually inquired about property listing photography. When I mentioned this to Grace, she claimed it was just research for someday when we buy our own place, but her explanation felt rehearsed and unconvincing. I also discovered paperwork hidden in Grace's purse when she asked me to grab her phone charger. Among the usual items, I found a folder containing a blank quitclaim deed with my name already filled in as the grantor and Grace's name as the grantee. There was also a business card for a notary public with an appointment scheduled for the day after the wedding. The documents made their intentions crystal clear. They weren't hoping I would eventually agree to help them buy their own place. They were planning to manipulate or pressure me into signing away my house immediately after the wedding ceremony, when emotions would be running high and family pressure would be at its peak. Confronting Grace about the hidden documents felt like stepping into a minefield where every word could trigger an explosion. I waited until Marcus was at work and Diana wasn't visiting, hoping a private conversation might lead to honest answers. Grace was in the kitchen making her usual elaborate breakfast when I placed the quitclaim deed on the granite countertop beside her coffee cup. "Want to explain what this is about?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as possible, despite the anger burning in my chest. Grace's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally the familiar tears that had become her default response to difficult situations. She grabbed the document and clutched it to her chest, as if I had discovered her diary. "Easton, you weren't supposed to see that," she whispered, her voice trembling with what I now recognized as practiced emotion. "Marcus thought we should be prepared for when you decide to help us. He said having the paperwork ready would make the process easier and faster. When I decide..." I repeated feeling my carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. This assumes a decision I never made and never agreed to make. This is my house, Grace. I built it, I own it, and I'm not signing it over to anyone. The tears stopped immediately, replaced by a flash of genuine anger that revealed her true feelings underneath the manipulative performance. You're being incredibly selfish, Easton. I'm your sister, and I'm pregnant with your nephew or niece. Family is supposed to help each other, not hoard resources while others struggle. Dear, struggle. I asked, gesturing around the kitchen with its high-end appliances and granite countertops. You're living in a $460,000 house, rent-free, eating food I buy, and planning a wedding that costs more than most people's cars. What exactly are you struggling with? Grace launched into a speech about emotional security and future planning. But I was no longer listening to her words. Instead, I was watching her body language and facial expressions, looking for signs of the deception I now knew lay underneath every interaction we had shared for months. I want you and Marcus to move out, I said, quietly, cutting through her monologue. You have 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Grace screamed at me about destroying her life and ruining her future, accusing me of jealousy and spite. She called me a failure as a brother and threatened to tell everyone in our family and social circle about my cruelty toward a pregnant woman. Her performance was so dramatic and convincing that for a moment, I almost doubted my own decision. But then I remembered the overheard phone conversation and the hidden legal documents, and my resolve hardened, like concrete setting in cold weather. Grace called Diana within minutes of our confrontation, sobbing into the phone about my sudden cruelty and complete lack of family loyalty. She described me as having a mental breakdown and claimed I had threatened to throw her belongings onto the street immediately. By the time Diana arrived 30 minutes later, Grace had worked herself into a state of hysteria that would have won awards at community theater. Diana burst through my front door without knocking, her face flushed with maternal rage and righteous indignation. She had gained weight since the divorce and moved with the heavy determination of someone accustomed to getting her way through sheer force of will. Her graying hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail that emphasized the harsh lines around her mouth. "How dare you threaten your pregnant sister?" Diana began before I could say a word. "Grace told me everything about your tantrum and your demands. I raised you better than this, Easton. I expected you to be the man of this family after your father left, not some selfish child who puts material possessions ahead of family welfare." I tried to explain about the hidden documents and the overheard conversation, but Diana dismissed my concerns as paranoid delusions and unfair attacks on Grace's character. She accused me of looking for excuses to avoid my family obligations and suggested that I was jealous of Grace's happiness and success in finding love and starting a family. Robert arrived an hour later, summoned by Diana's frantic phone calls about my mental state and dangerous behavior. He looked older and more worn than during his recent visits, but his capacity for manipulation and guilt seemed undiminished by time or circumstance. He moved through my house with the confidence of someone who belonged there, settling into my leather recliner, as if claiming territory. "Son, I think you need to step back and look at the bigger picture here," Robert said in his practiced therapist voice, the same tone he had used to justify his abandonment years earlier. "Grace is vulnerable right now, and she needs her family's support. You've done well for yourself with this house, but success means nothing if you don't share it with the people who matter most." The three of them spent the next 4 hours tag-teaming me with emotional manipulation, guilt trips, and veiled threats. They took turns playing different roles. Diana was the wounded mother disappointed in her son's lack of compassion. Grace was the vulnerable victim abandoned by her cruel brother, and Robert was the wise patriarch offering guidance to his confused child. They presented an ultimatum designed to force my compliance through social and emotional pressure. Either I would do the right thing and sign the house over to Grace as a wedding gift, or I would face permanent estrangement from my family and public humiliation within our social circle. They threatened to tell extended family members, family friends, and community acquaintances about my refusal to help my pregnant sister during her time of need. Robert suggested that my reputation in the neighborhood and at work would suffer when people learned about my selfishness and lack of family loyalty. Diana threatened to share details of my personal life and past mistakes with anyone who would listen. Grace promised to make sure everyone at her wedding knew exactly why her own brother wasn't participating in her celebration. But their threats only strengthened my determination to resist their manipulation. I had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to build my life and my home, to surrender them to people who saw me only as a resource to be exploited. The house represented more than just financial investment. It embodied my independence, my achievements, and my self-respect. During a brief moment, when they were whispering among themselves in the kitchen, I noticed Marcus's car pulling into my driveway. But instead of coming inside to join the family meeting, he sat in his vehicle, making phone calls for nearly 30 minutes. Through the window, I could see him gesturing animatedly while speaking to someone, occasionally glancing toward the house with what looked like concern or calculation. When Marcus finally entered the house, he seemed unusually quiet and distracted during the ongoing family discussion, while Robert, Diana, and Grace continued their coordinated assault on my position. Marcus kept checking his phone and stepping outside to take calls. His behavior struck me as odd, but I was too focused on defending myself against their manipulation to pay close attention to his activities. The confrontation ended when I firmly refused their ultimatum and gave them a final deadline. They had exactly 2 weeks to find alternative housing arrangements. Grace dissolved into tears again. Diana accused me of destroying the family, and Robert warned me that I would regret choosing material possessions over family relationships. But I had discovered something important about my own strength and determination. I would not be manipulated, guilt-tripped, or threatened into surrendering what I had earned through my own hard work. Whatever consequences their ultimatum brought, I would face them as a man who had stood up for himself and his principles. The morning of Grace's wedding dawned clear and crisp, with autumn leaves painting the landscape in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Despite everything that had happened, I had decided to attend the ceremony out of respect for the extended family members and family friends who would be there. I wore my best navy blue suit with a silver tie and hoped the day could pass without major drama. Riverside Manor looked magnificent in the early afternoon sunlight, its stone facade and manicured gardens providing the perfect backdrop for Grace's vision of fairy tale romance. Wedding guests arrived in expensive cars and designer outfits, creating an atmosphere of elegant celebration that masked the underlying family tensions. Grace looked stunning in her ivory silk gown with its cathedral-length train and intricate beadwork. Her dark hair was styled in an elaborate updo, adorned with pearl pins, and her makeup was flawless, despite the stress of recent weeks. She moved through the pre-wedding activities with practiced grace, accepting compliments, and posing for photographs while maintaining her performance as the radiant bride. Marcus appeared nervous during the ceremony, fidgeting with his bow tie and glancing frequently toward the assembled guests, rather than focusing on his bride. His best man, a college friend named Tyler Brooks, had to prompt him twice to repeat his vows clearly enough for the guests to hear. The officiant, Reverend Patricia Coleman, smiled encouragingly, but seemed to notice Marcus's distraction during the proceedings. The ceremony concluded without incident, and guests moved to the reception hall for cocktails and dinner. The room was decorated with white roses and golden candles that created a romantic ambiance, enhanced by the soft lighting from crystal chandeliers. Round tables covered in ivory linens accommodated the 200 guests who chatted animatedly, while servers offered champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I found myself seated at a table with distant relatives and family friends, who seemed unaware of the recent family conflict. They made polite conversation about my renovation work and asked about my plans for the future, giving me a brief respite from the tension that had dominated recent weeks. But the respite ended abruptly during the maid of honor's speech. Grace's college roommate Jennifer Hayes stood at the microphone with a champagne flute in her hand and a prepared speech that had clearly been coordinated with the bride. She began with the usual anecdotes about Grace's kindness and beauty before transitioning to topics that made my stomach clench with dread. "Grace is so fortunate to have such a generous family," Jennifer announced to the assembled guests. "Her brother Easton has provided her and Marcus with a beautiful home where they can start their marriage and raise their children. Grace told me all about the gorgeous 4-bedroom colonial that Easton renovated himself and then gifted to her as a wedding present." The guests turned to look at me with expressions of admiration and approval, applauding what they believed was my generous sacrifice for my sister's happiness. Several people nodded approvingly, and I heard whispered comments about what a wonderful brother I was and how lucky Grace was to have such family support. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger as I realized they had manipulated the entire wedding narrative to make it appear as if I had already agreed to transfer the house. They were using the public setting and social pressure to force me into a corner where denying their claims would make me look like a liar or someone who had cruelly changed his mind. Diana stood up next, taking the microphone with tears glistening in her eyes and her voice trembling with what sounded like maternal pride. "I want to thank my son Easton publicly for his incredible generosity toward his sister. The sacrifice he's making to ensure Grace and Marcus have a stable home shows the kind of man I raised him to be. I'm so proud of both my children tonight." The applause grew louder as guests celebrated what they believed was a heartwarming family story. Several people raised their champagne flutes in toasts to my supposed generosity, and I caught fragments of conversations praising my character and family loyalty. The manipulation was so skillfully executed that I almost admired its audacity. Robert then approached the microphone, his face beaming with paternal satisfaction as he prepared to deliver the final blow in their coordinated attack. He held up a professionally framed photograph of my house, with an engraved plaque below the image that read, "The Grace and Marcus Family Home." "This beautiful house represents everything our family values," Robert announced to the captivated audience. "Easton built it with his own hands, and now he's sharing it with the people he loves most. This is what real family looks like, folks. This is what sacrifice and love mean in action." The guests erupted in applause and cheers, many of them standing to honor what they believed was an extraordinary act of brotherly love. Several people approached my table to congratulate me, personally shaking my hand and commenting on my generosity and family values. Their genuine admiration made the manipulation even more painful and infuriating. When I could no longer tolerate the false narrative being celebrated around me, I stood up and approached the microphone area, intending to quietly correct the misunderstanding before it went any further. But Robert intercepted me. Before I could reach the front of the room, his face suddenly hard with determination beneath his earlier performance of paternal pride. "Don't you dare embarrass this family," he hissed in my ear, his voice barely audible above the background music and conversation. "Grace has worked too hard planning this wedding to have you ruin it with your selfishness. You will honor the commitment we announced, or you will leave immediately." "I never made any commitment," I replied firmly, matching his quiet tone but refusing to back down. "That house is mine, and I never agreed to give it away. You're lying to all these people." Robert's face flushed red with anger, and his carefully maintained composure cracked completely. "You ungrateful little bastard," he snarled loud enough for nearby guests to hear, and turn their attention toward us. After everything your family has done for you, this is how you repay us, by humiliating your sister on her wedding day. The confrontation was attracting more attention as Robert's voice rose above the background noise. Guests at nearby tables stopped their conversations to watch our exchange, their faces showing confusion and concern as they tried to understand what was happening. Grace noticed the disturbance and hurried over with Marcus close behind her face, pale beneath her wedding makeup. "Please don't do this here," Grace pleaded, grabbing my arm and trying to pull me away from the microphone area. "Can't we just celebrate tonight and discuss everything else later? I don't want my wedding ruined by family arguments." But I had reached my limit with their manipulation and lies. "There's nothing to discuss later, Grace. I never agreed to give you my house. And I'm not going to let you lie to all these people about something that never happened." Robert stepped closer, his face contorted with rage, and his hands clenched into fists. The elegant wedding reception atmosphere had transformed into something ugly and threatening as our family conflict exploded into public view. Guests were staring openly now, their celebration interrupted by the drama unfolding before them. "You will sign those papers," Robert declared, his voice carrying across the reception hall. "You will do what's right for this family, or I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of selfish, heartless person you really are." When I refused again, explaining calmly that the house belonged to me and would continue to belong to me, Robert's control snapped completely. He grabbed the heavy metal cake stand from the nearby dessert table, a ornate piece that must have weighed 10 pounds with its decorative scrollwork and solid construction. Before anyone could react or intervene, he swung the metal stand toward my head with all the force of his anger and desperation. The impact caught me above my left eyebrow, and the world exploded into stars and pain as I crashed to the marble floor. Blood immediately began flowing from the gash, staining my white shirt and pooling on the elegant floor. The reception hall fell into shocked silence as 200 wedding guests stared in horror at what they had just witnessed. Grace screamed and covered her face with her hands. Diana gasped and stepped backward, and Marcus stood frozen with his mouth hanging open. The only sound was my own breathing and the distant music that continued playing despite the violence that had just shattered the celebration. As I lay on the cold marble floor with blood trickling from my forehead, the wedding guests stood in stunned silence. Their celebration transformed into a nightmare none of them could have imagined. Grace knelt beside me, her ivory gown spreading around her like spilled milk, but her tears seemed more concerned with the disruption of her perfect day than with my injury. Robert stood over me, the twisted metal cake stand still gripped in his white-knuckled hands, his face showing more shock than remorse at what he had just done. Diana pressed her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, as she realized the legal implications of what her ex-husband had just committed in front of 200 witnesses. Several guests had pulled out their phones to call for emergency services, their voices creating a buzz of urgent conversation that filled the previously silent room. Jennifer Hayes was crying softly, her maid of honor speech forgotten in the chaos that had erupted. Reverend Coleman pushed through the crowd, her face pale with concern as she knelt to examine my injury. Then Marcus stepped forward, his phone in his hand, and his expression carrying a grim determination that seemed completely at odds with the nervous groom who had fumbled through his wedding vows just hours earlier. He looked down at me with what appeared to be genuine sympathy before turning to address the assembled guests. "Before anyone calls the police?" Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent reception hall. "There's something about this family that you all need to hear. Something that Grace and her parents thought they had hidden successfully, but something I've been investigating for weeks." Grace looked up at her new husband with confusion and growing alarm. "Marcus, what are you talking about? This isn't the time for speeches. Easton needs medical attention." But Marcus was already activating an audio recording on his phone, holding the device up so his voice would carry throughout the room. I've been recording conversations in that house for the past month because something felt wrong about this entire situation. What you're about to hear is Grace talking to her mother about their real plans for Easton's house. The recording began playing, and Grace's voice filled the reception hall with crystal clarity. The pregnancy was perfectly timed, Mom. Marcus never threatened to leave me. We planned this whole thing to create leverage for the house situation. He's actually excited about getting married and thinks Easton's house would be perfect for starting our family. We just need to keep up the pressure until he realizes that signing over the house is the right thing to do. The wedding guests gasped collectively as they heard Grace casually admit to manipulating her pregnancy announcement and fabricating Marcus's supposed ultimatum. Several people stepped closer to hear more clearly, their faces showing disgust and disbelief at what they were learning about the bride's character. Marcus played a second recording, this one featuring Robert's voice. We need to break Easton down emotionally before the wedding. If we can make him feel isolated and guilty enough, he'll sign those papers just to restore family peace. Diana, you work on the mother angle. Grace handles the sister guilt, and I'll come in as the disappointed father figure. Coordinate your approaches so he feels attacked from every direction. Diana's face went white as her ex-husband's voice revealed their calculated conspiracy to psychologically manipulate me into surrendering my home. She tried to speak, but Marcus held up his hand and continued playing recordings that exposed more of their scheme. The third recording captured Diana strategizing about the wedding reception. We'll announce the house transfer publicly during the toasts, so Easton can't back out without looking like a complete monster. Once everyone believes he's already agreed, the social pressure will force him to follow through. If he tries to deny it, we'll make him look like someone who broke his word to his pregnant sister. Guests were now openly expressing their shock and revulsion at what they were hearing. Several people shook their heads in disgust, and I heard angry whispers about fraud and manipulation throughout the crowd. The fairy tale wedding had become a nightmare of exposed lies and criminal conspiracy. Marcus wasn't finished with his revelations. There's more you need to know about Grace specifically, he announced, his voice growing harder with each word. I'm actually a licensed private investigator, and my parents hired me to investigate Grace's background before agreeing to this marriage. What I discovered was disturbing enough that I almost called off the wedding entirely. He pulled out a folder from his jacket pocket and began reading from official-looking documents. Grace Patterson has attempted this exact same scheme with 2 previous fiancés. In 2021, she convinced a man named Bradley Stevens to put her name on his condo deed by claiming pregnancy and family pressure. When he discovered she had lied about being pregnant, she had already transferred the property to herself and disappeared with the proceeds. The crowd murmured with growing anger and disbelief as Marcus continued exposing Grace's history of real estate fraud and romantic manipulation. Grace tried to interrupt, claiming the documents were forgeries, but Marcus had clearly prepared for her denials. In 2022, Marcus continued, she used the same pregnancy fraud to convince James Rodriguez to add her name to his house title. When he discovered her deception, she had already convinced his elderly parents to pressure him into signing over the property to avoid family scandal. She walked away with $420,000, while James lost his family home. The wedding guests were now staring at Grace with undisguised horror and revulsion. Several people backed away from her as if she carried some contagious disease, and I heard one elderly woman comment loudly about criminal behavior and heartless fraud. Marcus saved his final revelation for maximum impact. The pregnancy test Grace showed me was stolen from her coworker at the boutique where she works part-time. Medical examination will prove that Grace is not pregnant and never has been during our entire relationship. Everything about her desperation and vulnerability was theater designed to steal her brother's home. Grace finally found her voice screaming denials and accusations at Marcus while trying to maintain her innocent bride persona. But the recordings and documented evidence had already destroyed her credibility completely. The guests looked at her with a mixture of disgust and pity, seeing through her performance to the calculating criminal underneath. "Why?" asked Reverend Coleman, her voice filled with sadness and disappointment. "Why would you do something so cruel to your own family?" Grace's mask slipped completely as she realized her schemes had been exposed beyond any possibility of repair. "Because he had everything, and I had nothing," she shouted, pointing at me, where I still lay bleeding on the floor. "He got to build his perfect house and live his perfect life while I struggled to pay rent on a tiny apartment. It wasn't fair that he had so much when I deserved better." The raw greed and entitlement in her voice shocked even the guests who had been following the revelations closely. Her admission that she felt entitled to steal from her own family because of jealousy and perceived unfairness revealed the depth of her moral bankruptcy. Marcus looked down at her with obvious disgust before addressing the crowd one final time. "I want everyone here to witness that I am not actually marrying this woman. The marriage ceremony was part of my investigation, but I never signed the legal documents that would make it official. Grace Patterson is not my wife, and she never will be." As sirens approached in the distance, signaling the arrival of police and paramedics, the wedding reception had transformed into a crime scene where fraud, assault, and conspiracy had been exposed in front of 200 witnesses. Grace sat on the floor in her expensive gown, finally understanding that her carefully planned scheme had not only failed, but had destroyed her reputation and her future. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, police interviews, and medical examinations that would forever separate my life into before and after that wedding day. Paramedics cleaned and bandaged the gash on my forehead, determining that I had suffered a mild concussion, but no permanent damage from Robert's attack. The physical pain was manageable, but the emotional relief of having the truth finally exposed felt like emerging from underwater after nearly drowning. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived within 20 minutes of the first police officers, her experienced eyes taking in the scene of overturned tables, scattered wedding decorations, and traumatized guests who couldn't quite believe what they had witnessed. She interviewed Marcus first, collecting the audio recordings and documentation he had gathered during his investigation into Grace's criminal history. Robert was arrested immediately for assault with a deadly weapon, the metal cake stand qualifying as such under state law due to its weight and the force with which he had wielded it. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he looked older and more defeated than I had ever seen him. The reality of facing serious criminal charges finally penetrating his manipulative confidence. Grace faced multiple felony charges, including attempted real estate fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and filing false police reports about her supposed pregnancy, and Marcus's alleged threats. The district attorney's office, contacted by Detective Martinez, expressed strong interest in prosecuting given the documented pattern of similar crimes and the public nature of her attempted fraud. Diana initially tried to claim ignorance of the conspiracy, but the audio recordings clearly captured her voice, strategizing about psychological manipulation tactics and coordinating the family pressure campaign. She was charged as an accessory to attempted fraud and released on bail with the understanding that her cooperation with the investigation might reduce her eventual sentence. The wedding guests dispersed in shocked groups, many of them stopping to apologize to me for initially believing Grace's lies and congratulating me on what they now understood had been fictional generosity. Several people offered to testify if needed, their outrage at being manipulated into participating in the fraud, adding weight to the prosecution's case. Marcus revealed the full extent of his investigation during his statement to police. His parents, successful business owners who had learned to be cautious about potential romantic partners, had hired his private investigation firm to conduct a background check on Grace. After noticing inconsistencies in her stories about her past relationships and financial situation, the red flags started appearing immediately. Marcus explained to Detective Martinez, while I listened from a nearby chair, still processing the magnitude of what had been uncovered. Grace claimed to have attended college for 4 years, but the registrar's office showed she had dropped out after 1 semester. She said she worked as a manager at the boutique, but her tax records showed minimum wage earnings consistent with part-time retail work. His investigation had uncovered Grace's previous fraud attempts through public records searches and interviews with her former victims. Bradley Stevens and James Rodriguez had both been willing to share their experiences once they learned someone else might be targeted by the same scheme. Their stories revealed a pattern of calculated manipulation that went far beyond simple greed. She studies her targets carefully, Marcus continued. She looks for successful men who are isolated from their families or have complicated family relationships. She presents herself as vulnerable and in need of rescue, then gradually introduces pregnancy scares and housing crises that require her target's financial intervention. By the time they realize what's happening, she's already legally entitled to significant assets. The legal proceedings moved swiftly due to the overwhelming evidence and the public nature of Grace's attempted fraud. Robert accepted a plea bargain for assault charges that resulted in 6 months in county jail, followed by 2 years of probation and mandatory anger management counseling. His admission of guilt and expression of remorse seemed genuine, though I wondered if it stemmed from actual understanding of his actions or simply fear of harsher consequences. Grace initially attempted to maintain her innocence despite the recorded confessions, claiming the audio had been edited or taken out of context. But forensic analysis confirmed the recording's authenticity, and testimony from her previous victims established the pattern of behavior that made her guilt undeniable. She eventually accepted a plea agreement for attempted fraud that resulted in 18 months in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation and restitution payments to her previous victims. Diana's cooperation with prosecutors, including detailed testimony about the family conspiracy, resulted in a suspended sentence with community service and mandatory counseling. She seemed genuinely shocked by the extent of Grace's criminal history and expressed what appeared to be sincere remorse for her participation in the manipulation campaign. The aftermath of the wedding day revelations rippled through our extended family and social circle in ways that surprised me with their positive outcomes. Relatives who had been distant or disapproving of my selfishness regarding Grace's housing situation reached out to apologize and offer support once they understood the true circumstances. Several family friends expressed admiration for my refusal to be manipulated despite intense pressure. My reputation in the neighborhood and professional community, which Grace had threatened to destroy, actually improved as word spread about my resistance to fraud and manipulation. Co-workers at Patterson Construction praised my integrity, and several neighbors stopped by to express their respect for how I had handled an impossible situation. The house that had been the center of so much conflict became truly mine again once Grace and Marcus's belongings were removed under police supervision. Walking through rooms that had felt invaded and claimed by others, I experienced a profound sense of reclamation and peace. Every corner reflected my own choices and achievements rather than someone else's manipulation and greed. 6 months later, I decided to renovate the guest bedroom where Grace and Marcus had lived, transforming it from a space associated with betrayal into something entirely new. I converted it into a library and reading room with built-in bookshelves, comfortable seating, and large windows that filled the space with natural light. The transformation felt symbolic of my own healing and growth. My construction skills, honed through years of working on my own home, led to opportunities for starting my own renovation business. Word-of-mouth referrals from satisfied neighbors and friends created steady demand for my services. and I found deep satisfaction in helping other people transform their houses into homes that reflected their dreams and aspirations. During one of these renovation projects, I met Sarah Thompson, a elementary school teacher who had inherited her grandmother's house and wanted to update it while preserving its historic character. Our initial professional relationship grew into friendship and eventually romance as we worked together planning improvements that honored the past while embracing the future. Sarah brought qualities to my life that I hadn't realized I was missing. Her kindness was genuine rather than manipulative. Her support was freely given rather than calculated for personal gain, and her presence in my home felt natural rather than invasive. She appreciated the work I had put into creating my sanctuary and contributed her own touches without trying to claim ownership or control. One year after the wedding day disaster, Sarah and I hosted a housewarming party to celebrate the completion of my latest renovations and the beginning of our life together. The guest list included real friends who had supported me through difficult times, co-workers who respected my integrity, and neighbors who valued my contributions to the community. The party filled my house with genuine laughter and conversation, creating the kind of warm atmosphere I had always envisioned when planning my renovations. People admired the craftsmanship and design choices while celebrating the relationships and achievements that made the house a true home. Standing in my backyard that evening watching Sarah chat with friends near the stone patio I had built with my own hands, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment of contentment and peace. The house remained exactly what I had always intended it to be, a reflection of my hard work, my values, and my dreams for the future. Grace's attempt to steal my home had ultimately failed completely, but the experience taught me valuable lessons about family manipulation and personal strength. I learned that real family members support each other's dreams. Rather than trying to steal them, that kindness without integrity is just another form of manipulation, and that standing up for yourself is sometimes the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. The legal consequences faced by Grace, Robert, and Diana served as public validation that their behavior was not just morally wrong, but criminally fraudulent. Their punishment sent a clear message that families cannot abuse blood relationships to justify theft, manipulation, or violence against their own members. Most importantly, I discovered that my worth as a person wasn't measured by my willingness to sacrifice my achievements to make others comfortable, but by my integrity in maintaining my values even under intense pressure. The house I had built with my own hands remained mine, not because of legal documents or police intervention, but because I had found the courage to defend what I had rightfully earned. Looking around at the friends and loved ones celebrating in my home, I understood that I had gained something far more valuable than a house during this difficult experience. I had gained the knowledge that I could trust my own judgment, defend my own interests, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. The scars from Robert's attack faded within a few months, but the confidence and self-respect I gained from surviving Grace's fraud attempt became permanent parts of who I am. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to walk away from toxic people, even when they share your last name and claim to love you. True family isn't about blood relations or social obligations. It's about people who celebrate your successes instead of trying to steal them, who support your dreams instead of demanding you sacrifice them, and who love you for who you are, rather than what you can provide for them. As the evening wound down and our friends began saying their goodbyes, Sarah and I stood together on the front porch of the house that had nearly been lost to fraud and manipulation, but had ultimately become the foundation for a life built on honesty, hard work, and genuine love. The future stretched ahead of us, filled with possibilities that no one could steal or manipulate away. The house would always be special to me, not just as a financial investment or personal achievement, but as a symbol of what's possible when you refuse to let other people's greed and manipulation define your worth, or determine your choices. Sometimes the most important battle you'll ever fight is the one for your right to keep what you've earned and choose how to share your blessings. Have you ever faced family pressure to give up something you worked hard for? How do you think you would handle discovering that people you trusted were conspiring to manipulate and defraud you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to hear more stories about standing up for yourself and overcoming family manipulation, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that they have the right to defend their achievements and dreams. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth isn't measured by what you're willing to sacrifice for people who don't truly value you. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that protecting what you've earned makes you selfish or wrong.